Hi there. I'm Samantha Redondo, a licensed therapist and embodiment coach, and I want to welcome you to the Spiritual Embodiment Podcast. This is a space where we explore how our why meets our what. So our why being our sense of purpose and meaning making, how we kind of make sense of the world that we live in and the chaos that we experience here, meeting our here and now lived experience of being a body in the world. And I love this intersection of spiritual embodiment, and I find just the stories that come out of this space fascinating because it really does speak to the core of our humanity, being spiritual and being embodied. And I'm so excited to chat with you all today about a lived experience that I've had in the past week, but also has been a part of my life for years around chronic pain and injury. How do we stay embodied when it feels like our body's betraying us? How do we navigate through chronic pain, illness, and injury in a way that we stay connected to our body when everything in us is screaming to disconnect, to run away, to avoid, escape the feelings of pain and discomfort that we're experiencing? This is a topic that is very familiar for me in my own lived experience as someone who deals with chronic pain. And I wanted to share a bit of my story with that today as it's come up recently in my life. I'm kind of in a season of recovery right now from injury, and it's really hard. And so as I was sitting with pain and discomfort this week in my own body, I was really thinking about wow, I bet there's so many people who at least perceive themselves as struggling with embodiment because of the ways that injury, illness, and pain show up for them. And maybe they feel like they can never get over these hurdles to experience a more, what they imagine to be a more embodied life and experience. And I just wanted to speak to that question, to that fear of, can I ever feel embodied when there's days my body is so unbearable to be in? And the answer is yes. We all experience levels of discomfort and pain in our life, but especially those of us who deal with it on a more extreme and chronic level. Embodiment can be really tricky. And so I wanted to just maybe bust open some taboos and some assumptions we have about pain and illness, especially the chronic kind, and how we can remain embodied even on the days when it's really hard to be a body. So, like always, wanted to start off with a story. I recently had an experience of going to visit my family, and it was really lovely, needed time for all of us. And I got an invitation while I was there to join some family members at the church that they attend. And this happens to be a charismatic evangelical church. And I haven't been a part of a charismatic church in many, many years, but a lot of my spiritual trauma that I experienced was in a charismatic church setting. And so it was not this church that it happened in, but there's similar enough elements that I really had to sit with this decision of this invitation to go. And I knew it was really important to my family members that I attend and that they share in this experience with me and my husband, even though, we're not regular churchgoers at this point in our lives. And so I sat with some of the fear and maybe hindrance that I had with going, and was like, you know what, I think I can do this. I don't feel like I'm coerced or forced. I feel like I could have said no and we could talk about it and my family would have understood. But I was like, this is important to them and they've invited us in the past and we haven't gone. And it just felt like this is a good time. And I also feel resourced, feel like I have my supports. I have my partner with me who's a very regulating presence most of the time. And so yeah, felt like I was in my authenticity saying yes and going. Honestly, the experience itself was rather neutral. There were parts that were lovely. There were parts that I didn't love, but I was kind of able just to be like, that's not for me. I can take what's for me, leave the rest. Met some really lovely people there and knew that my family was really grateful that we went. But the night before, I just had so much like body anxiety. So what I mean by that is mentally I wasn't super worried. Like I felt really authentic in my choice to go the next day, but I felt really like restless in my body. I had a lot of muscle tension. I was kind of tossing and turning all night and it was hard to sleep. And just kind of chalked it up to like, oh, I did a longer run yesterday. My muscles just must be kind of agitated and tight. But it wasn't until the next night I did sleep better because I was pretty exhausted from not sleeping well the night before. But I woke up Monday morning and was like, I can't move my neck. Like it was totally frozen. I was in so much pain. We were driving home that day and it was just such a bummer. I was like, man, and this has happened to me over about the last 10 years where seemingly randomly, my neck will just what I call go out. So kind of be frozen, be stuck, lots of pain. Certain movements will like trigger a big jolt of pain. And so I'm really kind of like hesitant to move around or, it just really limits my mobility. And so often movement helps it feel better too. So this week spent a lot of energy and time icing, using heat, stretching, walking, like doing everything that I could to make the pain go away. And for those of you who are listening who have experience with chronic pain or chronic illness, when symptoms appear, when they emerge, all the old stories around those symptoms can also emerge. And so for me, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of despair and disappointment of like, well, this is my life now. I'm never going to feel any different, kind of depressive feelings. A lot of my mobility in my life is like limited during that time of pain. And so there's a sadness around that, a grief around that too, of not being able to do the things that I enjoy as much and just feeling like I have to put so much energy into caring for myself just to feel baseline, just to feel okay. And so there's some like loneliness and abandonment there, even though the people in my life love me, care about me, help me out, but it's like, I want them to fix my pain, right? So that kind of little Sam messaging will come out in those moments. And I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about and have your own stories about when you're in pain or illness. And so, was pretty laid out on the couch this week. Lots of scrolling on my phone, lots of, Netflix. And I was on social media and I saw a video of Hayley Williams, who's the lead singer of Paramore and just overall fabulous human. But she was talking about, she made a band tee with like literal x-ray photos from her chiropractor showing that she has like neck injury, like damage to her spine and her neck from headbanging, which is just like hilarious and horrible and all the things. But when I saw this video, I was like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that initially when my chronic neck pain started, I did go to the chiropractor and, sought some help there physiologically. And he asked me, we took some pictures of my neck and he asked me, have you been in multiple car accidents in recent years? And I was like, no, like back in middle school years ago, I was in a car accident and had some stuff after that, but like nothing recently. And my injuries in college from volleyball were my lower back. So like nothing with my neck. And he's like, interesting. You have signs of multiple whiplashes in your neck. And I was too embarrassed to say this to him. So we just kind of like, we're like, weird, we don't know what that's from. We're just going to treat it. But the charismatic church that I was a part of before that time really put an emphasis on and celebrated physical manifestations of the Holy Spirit. And so this looked like shaking, it looked like twitching, almost like seeing someone get electrocuted, like jolts. And maybe like their hands would shake. And then some people, their heads would shake like back and forth pretty violently. And that was how, at the time, I believed the Holy Spirit manifested through me, was my hands would shake and then it would kind of go up into my head and kind of this like yes, no, back and forth head shake, pretty quick and violent at times. And that was, I believe, what I didn't tell the doctor that because I was so embarrassed, but that's what I believe caused these multiple whiplash symptoms in my neck. And so when I saw this Haley Williams video, I remembered that. I had just blocked it out, I think, because of the shame and embarrassment of that moment. But I was like, oh my gosh, this pain, which I do believe like the whiplashes at this point, it's been about 10 years that stuff has healed in my neck. I don't think it was severe enough from what I remember from the x-rays to like Haley Williams have some like permanent disc damage and things like that. It was early stages still. But when I saw this video and it brought this memory up, it just struck me that, oh, going back into a charismatic church, into a space that I haven't been in years, where, you know, there were some similar manifestations that people were experiencing, you know, nothing on the level of the space that I was in years ago, but enough to remind me of what that space felt like. It makes a lot of sense that my body would have this reaction physiologically so soon after that experience. And I'll tell you why it makes sense to me. But first, I want to share a little bit about how I've kind of made sense of physical manifestations, because I feel like that's a question that some of you might be thinking, or I might get asked. And I definitely want to do an episode in the future talking more about my experience. I'll also link the episode that I did with Jubilee on the Healedish podcast, talking about my experience. We both were a part of the same group. But I wanted to share a little bit about kind of what I believe about physical manifestations now and why people do that, really. And I think the Haley Williams example is so helpful because, like, when she was in this interview, the interviewer, I forget who it was, but he was asking, like, so do you regret the headbanging? Like, you have this permanent injury to your neck now that like causes you pain. Do you regret it? And she was like, honestly, no. Like, it's a part of the music. It's a part of the scene. It's a part of like the culture I was in, you know, in so many words. But my paraphrase of her is like, this is what you do in this like punk band space. And I've loved my experience of being in this band, being in this space. I love our fans. This was all worth it to me, which is fascinating. You know, she's someone who lives with chronic pain, I'm assuming, because of this. And she doesn't regret the headbanging. I feel differently about my physical manifestations. I do regret that experience, but I think Haley's example, maybe we can find some understanding through it. When I think about kind of like the punk rock headbanging culture, are part of this groups of people who all enjoy this music, and they also enjoy the experience of these shows, right? There's kind of like the moshing and the dancing and the headbanging that go along with this music that really, it's an emotional experience and it's a physiological one. Like being in this group of people, having this music that some people would think is kind of more like in your face, angry, angsty, helps people express maybe some of those feelings that they have that match the music, and they can really like let go and like kind of get lost in the emotional and physiological experience of moshing, headbanging, dancing, being in this group of people who are all kind of having this common experience. And so, you know, part of being a punk rock musician for Haley is leading people in that, is modeling the behavior that this group, this culture, has said this is what it means to belong to this punk rock culture. You bang your head, you wear this kind of clothes, you sing these kind of songs. And I would argue that it's kind of the same in the charismatic church and in these spaces where there's a lot of emotion and kind of like overwhelming sensation that are a part of our worship and our gathering. And in the space I was in this charismatic megachurch, like I said, it was normal for people to display physical manifestations of, quote, the Holy Spirit. And it was also celebrated and kind of a sign that you belonged. So the goal of worship, of gathering, of these times was like to honor God in a way that he would show up in the room and start to, quote, move, you know, start to act in a way that we could physically see, emotionally feel that the Spirit of God was among us and was healing people, doing miracles, encouraging us, you know, whatever it was. And so these physical manifestations were like a sign. That was definitely something that was talked about a lot, like a sign of God's presence. They were like testimony and proof that one, God existed, but also that like he still heals today, he still does miracles. Like a lot of the tenets of charismatic Christianity were based on the proof of these things. Like, we believe God does these things, and here's the proof. Like, people are falling out in the spirit, or what's called slain in the spirit, which is highly problematic. People are getting seemingly healed, and people are speaking in tongues. People are also physically moving their bodies in ways that isn't maybe normal, or like there must be some spiritual explanation to these signs. And so in this environment, there was a lot of implicit, even explicit pressure to show these signs, to show these manifestations of God's presence. Belonging's a big motivator, a big driver of behavior. A lot of that process happens unconsciously, of kind of the ways that we scan the group that we want to be a part of and then start to act in that way. Just like someone going to a punk rock show being like, man, this music is awesome. Everyone's banging their head. Okay, I guess that's what you do. And so there's a lot of those kind of same cues in this environment, and one of them is physical manifestations. Add that on top of a lot of the like overwhelm and emotional flooding that happens in these environments, especially during a worship service. And, you get to a point kind of like at a punk rock show, at a Paramore show, where like your body's just doing stuff because you're so in the music, you're so in the experience, you're in this like communal collective experience as well. And so I had a lot of those experiences where I was violently shaking my head back and forth, injuring my neck. And I do regret that time, that like maybe my body didn't want to be pushed in those ways, but that is what belonging looked like in that space. And so unconsciously, that's what I adopted. So getting back to this week, and when I made that connection through the Haley Williams video of, oh my gosh, this is so related to my history with this cult and the trauma that happened there, I started to get curious about, okay, body, what are you saying? And this was after about a week of doing everything I could physiologically to help my body, ice, heat, stretching, all the things I mentioned, and feeling really frustrated, like kind of feeling at the end of my rope of like, this again, like it's been so long since I've experienced this. I feel so defeated and disappointed that this is back. And so when I made this realization, it actually gave me so much self-compassion, because I was like, oh, there's something deeper going on here. Like there's a deeper story. It's not just I slept weird. It's not just I worked out a little bit too hard the day before. There's a new layer of trauma that's surfacing that wants to be expressed and integrated and released from my body. And so first I want to talk a little bit about trauma and our bodies. How is trauma stored in our body? We might have heard that before, or this is a new concept, but the way that traumatic memory works is it's not stored as like a normal story. And this is part of like when someone experiences something traumatic, maybe they're getting interviewed by the police or something like that, or even in therapy, and they're asked to tell the details of the story. Often they can't really remember much. Sometimes it's totally blank, like missing parts of their memory. Sometimes maybe they can remember a feeling or a sensation, but they can't really remember a typical story like I would tell you about my day going to the grocery store or going for a run. And so this is because trauma memory actually gets stored in our body. And this body memory can then resurface unexpectedly. So this is like when people have PTSD and they talk about getting triggered and having like a flashback or a memory where they feel like they are in, the line of fire in the grocery store or whatever it is. This is a body memory that somehow came to the surface, woke back up in that moment. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes there's kind of a trigger or a situation that brings that about, like what I experienced going to church. But this body memory really is our body's way of trying to release and move through the stuck survival energy that got awakened or activated during the traumatic experience. So when we experience a trauma, kind of like I talked about in the last episode, our survival activation of our nervous system, which looks like fight or flight or freeze and shut down, gets turned on, gets activated so that we can fight, the predator, we can run away to safety, we can play dead so the predator goes away. These are very base mammal instincts that animals share with us. And when in that moment, we can't physically do the thing that our body wants to do to protect us or to escape, that survival energy activation actually gets stuck in our biology. It gets stuck in our muscles. It gets stuck in our fascia. It gets stuck in our tissue, in our cells. And until our body is able to move in a way that it wants to, and also be just acknowledged, like what that experience was like for us, attended to, if you will, that survival energy remains stuck. And if you want to know more about this, Bessel van der Kolk talks about it in his book, The Body Keeps a Score. Peter Levine talks about it in his book, Waking the Tiger. There's lots of somatic researchers who have looked at trauma and studied it and really discovered there is something happening in the body where this survival energy is getting stuck for people when they experience a trauma. And this is why they deal with PTSD. This is why they deal with these things so far after the experience has happened, and why it seemingly is random when this activation gets triggered. And so how do we deal with this? For me, remembering, oh my gosh, I do have a trauma, emotional and spiritual trauma from this experience that's now showing up in pain in my neck. What did I do? So first, to start with curiosity. So when we're in pain, nobody likes being in pain, right? So the number one thing that we want to do when we're in pain is avoid, escape, dissociate, bye-bye. And that's some of what I was doing through just trying to make it feel better. I'm on Netflix, I'm scrolling on my phone, I'm just trying to not be aware of the pain, which is very normal, very understandable. So we don't want to judge or shame our normal response to want to fix the pain, want to avoid the pain. But if we can resource ourselves enough, maybe through just the physical things to help the pain feel some relief, getting some comfort from loved ones or animals, watching a comfort show, being cozy, if we can feel safe enough in our bodies to start to turn towards the pain. And maybe it's not feeling all of the pain, but how I like to think about it is maybe we're just dipping a toe in, or maybe we're exploring our bodily sensations around the pain. So if one part of my neck is in pain, maybe I explore, what does my shoulder feel like? Oh, it is kind of tight. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe I can just sense into my shoulder for now, or maybe I can sense into my head because that kind of feels okay, but it's still connected to my neck. And so as we start to get closer to the sensations associated with the pain, so maybe gently moving around the painful area, maybe I move my shoulder a little bit, see how that feels. And I'm paying close attention to the physical sensations and just breathing and noticing if ever it feels too much, backing off, maybe looking around the space that I'm in or orienting to a different part of my body, patting my legs, something that's not as activating. But starting with this curiosity in a slow, titrated way, you might start to see that the pain starts to shift or change. And there might actually be some physiological activation that happens. Sometimes the pain gets worse when we're looking at it. And I think self-compassion is so helpful in these moments of oh, wow, I almost see the pain or that part of my body as a child or a pet, something that I really love that's mine to care for. And it's telling me it's not okay. It's telling me a story. And so I can pull on that part of myself that is nurturing, is compassionate, to get curious about oh man, yeah, you're in so much pain. Wow, this is a lot. what's going on for you? What's the story here? Just allowing that curiosity to kind of unfold the experience that this part of my body is holding. Because like I said, this trauma experience got stuck in this part of my body. And so as I started to sit with this week, exploring the pain around my neck, exploring the sensation that was there, and then getting curious about the story, the piece, the kind of the thread that I started to pull was this experience of belonging, of I felt like I had to do this. I had to participate in this violent shaking of my neck, these physical manifestations of the spirit, because I so wanted to belong in this space. I thought this was the end all be all of community, of spirituality, of like my life, like me having a good, fulfilling life, of my connection to God, my connection to people. And I so wanted to fit in that I put myself through this. And as I started to just validate and have compassion for this experience that a version of me had, that was stuck in my body, I started to notice a softening. I started to notice tears, a little like shuddery breath, but some deeper breaths. I started to notice kind of some twitching and shivering in my shoulder muscles, a little bit of like heat around my neck too. And these are things that as survival energy starts to dissipate, we'll notice some physiological but also emotional sensations. And so part of this experience is just like witnessing. So just staying with that experience if it feels tolerable. And like I said, if it at any point feels overwhelming, we can back off. We can focus on another part of the body. We can look around the room. It's also really helpful to do this work with a therapist, with a somatic experiencing practitioner, with an embodiment coach. I have a lot of training in this, so I feel like I'm able to hold space for myself as I work through this, but it's really, really helpful to have someone walk through it with you. And I have had times in my life where I've had my own somatic practitioners because I knew I needed that extra support to feel into some of this stuff. And so as we're kind of witnessing, we're holding space for, we're getting curious about the story that's held in our body, maybe there's some like micro movements that start to want to happen. And so you can maybe play with that. Like right now, I'm like moving my shoulders up and down. That might be a movement that my body wanted to do. And so part of what we're doing here as we're exploring movement is helping to release some of that survival energy to maybe move through the body. Peter Levine, who is the founder and creator of somatic experiencing, which is a type of somatic therapy, he talks a lot about with this survival energy that got activated in the trauma. Part of resolving that is letting the body move in a way that it wanted to when the trauma happened. So that might be like your body wanting to protect itself, like your hands coming up to cover your head because, you were going to get hit or something was going to happen, or maybe you wanted to push something or someone away that was scary or threatening, or maybe you wanted to, run away. And so there's a lot of activation in your legs and your feet. And so moving your feet in a way, even just like a gentle kind of walking motion while you're seated, like raising and dropping your heels can really help that trauma energy discharge. Sometimes we might feel like, I need to run 10 miles to get this energy out. But it's these like slow micro movements kind of intuitively with our own witnessing, our own attention there, that can move so much energy. That's really, really helpful. And I love a good run. I love a good Peloton cycling ride to get some energy and stress out. But I think for deep, deep trauma, there's a lot of tenderness, there's a lot of vulnerability and emotion that can come up. And so when we're kind of in these big muscle experiences like a run or a bike ride, it can actually take away from some of the nuance and the slowness of micro movements of like what's needed when we're addressing trauma. And so sometimes the feeling, the sensation, or the felt sense feels really giant, feels really big in those moments. But just that little bit of movement and actually slowing the movement down is what's needed to release that stored energy. And so I like to think of the sensation that's associated with this stuck trauma energy like a wave. So we might, like I said, as we get curious about the sensation, start to feel like, ooh, the pain's getting bigger, or there's a lot more here than I thought. And so there's kind of a rise, building of the wave, and then maybe it crests and there's like shaking or crying or muscle tension or like something that kind of feels like a crescendo. And then on the other side, the wave falls and there's a release. So that might be like muscle tension relaxing or a breath deepening or even just like body awareness coming back. Maybe we felt kind of disconnected or disassociated, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can actually feel my hands or feel my feet now. Our heart rate might slow. And so this is what I like to think about as like the resolution. Like we kind of came down that wave, and now we get to do recovery. Like I said, this work is so tender and so vulnerable. And so I think the recovery piece is really important. Firstly, physical recovery. So after I kind of had my experience of feeling into this pain and trauma, doing a bit of movement, riding that wave of sensation, and then feeling some resolution on the other side, I made sure to build things into my day that were really gentle and slow. Cuddling on the couch with my dog and a cozy blanket, making a cup of tea, going to bed early, having a nice hot shower, things that felt really nurturing and told my body, hey, you're safe. And so that is a really important part of the recovery process. And I also think a really important part of the process is grief. And often when we talk about trauma recovery, it can be, let's just feel better. Let's get to the point of like wanting to get back to normal or not have these symptoms anymore, which is a very normal and human desire when we have trauma symptoms that make us to feel stuck or triggered. But I think what we can sometimes want to skip over or miss is grieving the experience. And so I think that can be a really beautiful part of integration of this somatic work with trauma energy, is actually allowing for the story to come back online. So after we kind of move through this wave of the body memory being stuck and finally getting released, then can we actually move that experience into that story memory? Now that it's not stuck in our bodies anymore, can we actually explore the story? And so this can be helpful, journaling, or maybe talking to a therapist or a trusted friend about your story of the experience and making sense of it. And so we've been talking a lot about embodiment on this podcast so far to kind of lay some groundwork, but I wanted to mention some spiritual practices that I think could be really important, especially when we're thinking about the grief part of this integration of this work. And the first is the idea of dissent. And dissent is talked about kind of in more like woo-woo, new age spiritual spaces. I think about like when we look at the seasons, like fall is often a time of dissent. It's the dark half of the year. We're kind of going down to the underworld. I also think the idea of dissent is connected to shadow work. Carl Jung talked a lot about needing to own and take responsibility for and acknowledge our shadow, the parts of us that we avoid, that we don't like, that we kind of deny about ourselves, when really looking at our shadow, looking at the parts of us that are hard to accept and hard to love, is the work of integration, is the work of actually showing up authentically and being able to be our whole self. And so this dissent process can be hard, can be icky, can be uncomfortable, but I think it dovetails so perfectly with this somatic work and and our experience of pain, because it's kind of like how I think about it is like, well, my experience right now already sucks. I might as well just like look at the hard parts of life. So when we let ourselves actually feel into the grief of what happened to us, to feel sad and remorseful for this version of us that had to experience the trauma, that had to experience what it experienced, that was hard. We actually are honoring this version of ourselves. We're giving our story weight. We're saying, hey, this matters. And I think we skip over the grief process because it's that shadow work, it's that dissent, it's that, oh, I'd rather just move on. This part of my life is done. I don't want to look at this again. But especially when we have a layer of trauma that's resurfacing and maybe showing up in our body, this grief work, this dissent work is so important because it allows us to tell the story authentically to ourselves. And the only way that we can tell our story to others, or in a way that is impactful to others, is to be able to also tell the story to ourselves and feel our feelings about it. And I think a lot of people try to tell their story publicly or, share it in a way that makes an impact, and they haven't fully told their story to themselves and like felt the impact of that too. And therapy can be a really great place to do that, with a loving, supportive presence who can help you stay with the story when it's hard. The other spiritual practice that is connected to this is the idea of lament. And this idea comes out of Jewish writings, and in Christianity, we can think of it as the Old Testament as well. But when we look at writings like the Psalms, there's a lot of lament poems in the Psalms, where often it's David, sometimes it's other writers who are exploring their shadow, exploring grief, exploring the hard parts of life. And these are called lament poems because they do deal with grief. They do deal with despair. They deal with loss. They deal with suffering and pain. And sometimes there's a silver lining. Sometimes there's and yet I'll hope in the Lord, who is my refuge. And sometimes there isn't. And I really appreciate these writings because I think it holds the nuance for sometimes we do have hope, even in the midst of the worst circumstances. And sometimes we don't. And I like to tell clients who are going through grief or just moments that are really hard, hey, can I hold your hope balloon for you while you go through this? Even if you can't feel it, even if you can't hold it, why don't I hold it for you till you're ready to take it back again? And I think this is why community is so powerful in times of grief, because there's some days where it's really hard to hold hope for ourselves. This last week, there were moments when I did feel a lot of despair. I did feel like this is never going to get better. I'm always going to be in pain. Even if my logical brain knew that wasn't true. But there's still a part that's like, maybe this is the time. Maybe this is the rest of my life. And so I think being able to have people in our life who can be hopeful for us, who can hold the silver lining, even if they're not telling us in that moment, because it's hard to hear silver lining when you're in the despair moment, but can just help us to keep going, to trust, to do the things we need to do just to get through the day. I think that's really powerful. And so this practice of lament, of writing and feeling into our story of loss, our story of grief, whether it ends on a positive note or not, can help us to make meaning and make sense of senseless things, even if we don't know what that meaning is in the moment. Even if we're just writing our angriest, angstiest punk rock laments, it does help us to find some release and relief. It can help us just to put those feelings somewhere else than in our bodies for a moment. And this is why I think lament is so powerful of a practice when we're going through hard times, especially when our physical body is going through the hard times and it feels really hard to practice embodiment. I think some other tools that help me when I'm having a hard time physically is knowing that I can orient to safety outside of my body. So like I said, a cozy blanket, a beloved animal, a safe human, being in nature, even like having a warm bath or a shower, icing, things that can help us to shift our nervous system state, but aren't necessarily dependent on like our physiological sensations within our body changing. Sometimes that's really hard to do. And there's things that we need to do just to be able to get through the moments of pain. And that's okay too. So I hope this was helpful for you if you're someone who's experiencing chronic pain, chronic illness, or injury, to get curious about your own story of trauma and maybe the body memories that are stored within your body. I also want to say sometimes illness and injury just happen. And there's nothing that we could have done to prevent them or nothing we're doing wrong if we're still experiencing them after trying everything. But I hope that getting curious about your own story and the story that your body is telling you and having some compassion and giving those parts of your body, those versions of you, some attention and love can help to relieve some of those overwhelming sensations and symptoms. And if you'd like some additional support on your journey of recovery, or dealing with chronic issues like we talked about, I'd be happy to chat more. You can see the link in the show notes for a free discovery call, or I'd be happy to also connect you to resources that have been helpful for me or folks in my world that I think are really, really great at supporting folks with chronic pain and illness. I'm so grateful for you listening and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As always, I'm here to hold space for us to chat about this intersection of embodiment and spirituality, even when that's tricky and hard. I look forward to seeing you next time, where we will again hear stories and have discussions about what happens when our why of spirituality meets our what of embodiment. Till next time, take good care.